So you're working out and don't have access to weights. What do you do to progress your strength, right? So if you don't have access to weights, or even if you do have access to weights and you don't have a small enough plate to jump to the next one or a small enough weight to kind of transition, here are a couple things that you can do to help make the exercise harder without adding weight so you can continue to progress your strength. So first I want to talk about progressive overload. Progressive overload is the concept where you have to constantly challenge your muscles to continue to gain strength. So let's say you start out and you can do 10 squats, and those get easier over time because your muscles are adapting, you're getting stronger. In order to continue to get stronger from that point, you need to then make that exercise harder. So make the squats harder in some way, whether it's progressing to one leg, adding some weight, etc. The most common way that people do this is adding weight, but that's not always possible or feasible for some people. So I'm going to talk about 5 ways that you can progress without adding weight. So the most common way that people think about progressing in exercise without adding weight is to change up the tempo. So this means slowing it down, and this just increases your time under tension of these muscles. So the longer the time, the more challenging it is for those muscles. Kind of makes sense, right? So like if you slowly lower down in a pull-up, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. If you add a pause at the top, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. Same thing with a squat. If you go slow on the way down, pause, and then come back up, it's going to be a little bit more challenging without even adding any sort of weight or any sort of resistance or anything like that. So that's one way that you can make an exercise harder. Typically, this is done with that eccentric portion. So the eccentric portion is when your muscles are lengthening but still contracting. So think of a slow lower of a pull-up. Your muscles, your lats, are lengthening, but they're still working to slowly control that descent. Same thing with the squat. As you lower into the squat, your muscles are lengthening. So think about your glutes, your hip is flexing or bending. You have to control it, and then you can squeeze it and contract it to stand you back up. And that's more of a concentric where it's shortening and contracting. Eccentric is lengthening and contracting. Another way to progress an exercise without adding weight is to change the lever arm. So if you think about physics with a lever, the farther out that you hold something, the longer the lever arm and the more demand it is on those muscles to control it because the force is bigger, I guess. So if you're holding a water bottle out farther in front of you, it's going to be more challenging than if you're holding it close to you. That's why proper lifting mechanics is you bring the weight as close as you can to you versus holding it out here, because if you hold it out here and you're like carrying things around all day, that puts a lot of strain on your back and you're already going to be fatigued regardless, right? So proper lifting mechanics keep the weight close to you. But in the respect of making things harder, right? So if you're thinking about, for example, a front lever, so holding your body, holding onto a bar and coming out in front. Straight legs is going to be harder than bent legs because your center of mass is closer to underneath the bar when your legs are tucked and then farther away when they're straight. So that's one way to make it more challenging and to progress the exercise. If you think about a push-up, right? So a kneeling push-up is going to be easier than a toe push-up or a standard push-up. And that's because you're increasing the lever arm, so your muscles have to work harder. Same thing with Russian twists, for example. If you have your feet anchored and you're twisting from side to side, the farther back you lean, the more challenging it's going to be on your core. Same thing here. If you lean back farther, you're increasing the lever arm because the center of mass is farther away from your anchor point, and that way it makes the exercise harder, right? So these things, you can all play a role with different exercises. Some work better than others, but there are a couple of examples where you can use the lever arm to make it more challenging. Another way that you can make it more challenging is to progress the exercise itself. So if you, like going back to the squat example, you can progress to one leg. So same thing with arms. If it's a double arm exercise, like a push-up, for example, you can progress towards a one-arm push-up. And that doesn't mean you just have to jump to a one-arm push-up, but you can like fingertip the other one or shift your weight slightly over to one side or even like push up with 2 and then slowly lower down with 1. Whichever way you want to progress it, there's a ton of different ways. Same thing with pull-ups, same thing with squats. So double leg squat to maybe a staggered stance squat to maybe a staggered stance squat in a different position so you don't have to use your leg quite as much. And And then you can progress towards more unilateral work from bilateral work. Another way that you can progress the exercise itself is, so for example, if you're only doing the eccentric lowering portion of a pull-up, you can progress towards the full pull-up. You could increase the range of motion of that exercise, depending on the exercise. Things like that. That is going to make the exercise more challenging, and you don't even have to add weight. Another way is just adding reps. So going back to the time under tension principle, adding reps is going to do that same thing, except just over more reps versus in the same rep. It's a common misconception that like under 6 reps is for strength, 8 to 12 reps is for hypertrophy, like 15 plus is for muscular endurance. In reality, yes, those rep ranges are biasing those certain things, but that doesn't mean you can't gain strength in any one of those ranges, you can't hypertrophy in any one of those ranges, etc. So if you're working on building muscle and progressing strength, you just have to go a little bit closer to failure, if that makes sense. And the 5th tip here on how to progress an exercise without adding weight is to ensure proper form. And this one's probably the most important, and people don't think about it probably enough, but actually thinking about the muscle that you're working, driving through your heels in a hip thrust, for example, really squeezing your butt as hard as you can, ensuring your knees don't fall inwards in a squat, things like that. Focusing on the form is going to make it a little bit more challenging because you're using the right muscles. You might bias a certain muscle a certain way and really isolate those muscles that you're trying to target. And it also reduces risk of injury if you're doing an exercise properly. There are 5 tips there. If you do have any questions, go ahead and drop them below. Let me know if this was helpful and anything else you want me to chat about. If you are not sure where to start when you're first starting getting back into training, or if you're just getting back into after an injury, go ahead and watch this video here, and I will see you back in the next video. So you or even if you're like holding a water bottle, it's easier to hold the water bottle out. Even if you're thinking, yeah.